Welcome, everyone. Hello, welcome to Stanford. Thank you for coming during the very, very, very busy week of the quarter. And my name is Olga Tremanskaya. I am at the GSB and I'm MBA 2. I'm about to graduate. And I grew up in Russia, which is why I really, really, really wanted this event to happen. Thank you so much for being here. So Bill Browder, our guest today, is a Stanford GSB graduate, the founder and the CEO of Hermitage Capital, the largest foreign investor in Russia. In his pursuit to expose corruption through shareholder activism, Bill faced severe consequences when declared a national security threat in Russia. His lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was murdered in prison after uncovering a $230 million fraud committed by Russian government officials. Bill initiated a campaign for government sanctions on human rights abusers and highly corrupt officials. The Magnitsky impunity enjoyed by those who perpetrate unspeakable atrocities. Over the past few years, the sanctions were applied to the Russian nationals involved in the death of Sergei Magnitsky, Saudi nationals involved in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, Myanmar military generals, President of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, and many more. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Bill Browder. All right, welcome back.
Yeah.
How does it feel?
It feels so good to be here. My 2 years at Stanford were the best 2 years of my life, and it always reminds me when I step back on campus, what am I doing living anywhere else? But so you're all very lucky to be here. My first bit of advice is don't leave. And also, I'm also very honored that during finals week, any of you would have carved an hour out of your busy schedules to join me. So,
well, you can always come and teach. I think in one of your interviews you mentioned that unfortunately you were not taught at Stanford how to fight oligarchs.
Yeah.
And so if this is a class that you think you could teach, please come. We'll welcome you back.
Thank you.
All right, how about we start? So Bill, the geographic footprint of your campaign is truly impressive. Tell me a little bit about what you're doing right now.
So the main thing that I'm doing right now, well, I guess there's two things that I'm working on right now. My story starts, of course, here at Stanford, and then ends up with this little introduction you gave, but basically has been dominated for the last decade, more than a decade, by the murder of Sergei Magnitsky, my lawyer. And the fight for justice for Sergei just keeps on going on and on and on in all sorts of different ways. And so after he was killed, I started to travel the world to get sanctions imposed on the people who killed him. And one of the people who joined me in this mission was a Russian opposition politician, a young man named Vladimir Kara-Murza. And I would show up at the US Congress, at the Canadian Parliament, at the British Parliament, and various other places, and I would explain what the Russians did to Sergei Magnitsky, the tool that we had come up with, which was to freeze their assets and ban their visas. And the common question was, this sounds like it makes a lot of sense, but we don't want to do anything that would punish the Russian people. We'd like to hear from the Russian people. And this young man, Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is almost 20 years younger than me, would come along with me to these different lawmaking bodies, and he would explain that on behalf of the Russian people, the thing that they hate the most is their leaders killing their people and stealing from them. And they wanted the Magnitsky Act as well. And he was such a powerful and persuasive speaker. He spoke perfect English, perfect French, and would show up and just make such a charismatic presentation that between the two of us, we succeeded in getting these 35 Magnitsky Acts passed. And the Russian government and Vladimir Putin personally hated Vladimir for doing this. And in 2015, when he was back in Moscow, they tried to kill him with poison, and he barely survived. He went into coma, multiple organ failure. It was all very awful, and they gave him a 5% chance of living, and he somehow pulled through. He kept on going back to Moscow, and then they poisoned him again in 2017. And at the beginning of this war, he said, I need to go back again. I need to protest this war. I begged him not to go back. He was actually in London on his way back to Moscow. And I said that if the worst that happens is they kill you, the best that happens is they put you in jail. You can't go back. And he said, I have to go back. How can I protest the war? How can I stand up to Putin if I'm afraid to go back to my own country? And he went back in late March of 2022, last year, after the war had started. And he gave a CNN interview and an MSNBC interview calling Putin a war criminal and a murderer. And shortly after his CNN interview, he was arrested by 5 police officers, put in pretrial detention, put on trial for various trumped-up crimes, and found guilty in April of high treason and sentenced to 25 years in prison. And so now I'm spending a lot of my time trying to get Western governments to support him. And I was just in Ottawa on Monday at the Canadian Parliament. The Canadians have a program they call honorary citizens, and they've only given out 7 times: Nelson Mandela, Malala, a few other people, and we're trying to get Vladimir honorary citizenship. Why does this matter? It matters because the Russians need to see him as a valuable hostage, not one that they can kill. He's already lost more than 50 pounds of weight. He can't feel his feet anymore from the nerve damage done from the poisoning. He's losing sensation in his arm, his left arm. And I feel like I need to do anything I can, because for me, the idea of having another one of my close confidants and friends killed is just impossible for me to contemplate. And I remember I was here in Stanford. It was in October of 2009. I was giving a talk at the business school when Sergei was still in jail, talking about Sergei, and then he died a month later. And I'm praying and hoping that doesn't happen to Vladimir, and doing whatever I can to stop it. So that's a big part of my life right now. The other thing that I'm working on more generally on the war with Ukraine is like everybody else, I saw this terrible atrocity being committed. And like everybody else, I wanted to do something. Some people, gathered supplies for the Ukrainians. Some people went to the front line. But my unique skill is I've spent the last 13 years going around governments and parliaments around the world to pass legislation to freeze Russian assets. And a week after the war started, the West froze $350 billion of Russian central bank reserves. And so the other big project is to try to figure out how not just to freeze these assets, but how to seize these assets so they can be used for the defense and reconstruction of Ukraine.
Thank you so much for your work. We'll return to the question of sanctions a little bit later. Now, why don't we just travel back in time for a little bit? The United States right now is preparing for the next presidential elections, and many raise concerns that there might be foreign intervention, there might be lobbyists coming to America. Take us back to 2017, when you learned that you had been the subject of the conversation in the Trump Tower between Trump's campaign officials and the Russians. What did you find out? How did it make you feel?
So ever since the passage of the Magnitsky Act, I've been on Vladimir Putin's hit list. And he hates the Magnitsky Act more than anything. Why does he hate it? Because it freezes the assets of human rights abusers and kleptocrats. And Vladimir Putin is a human rights abuser. He's a kleptocrat. He's got an enormous fortune, and he keeps it offshore, and I was responsible for a piece of legislation that could potentially make his money inaccessible to him, and so he hated me for that. His hatred led to death threats, kidnapping threats, 8 Interpol arrest warrants, lawsuits, movies being made about me, all sorts of stuff. And it was very interesting because, I knew he hated me, but I didn't know what other things he was going to come up with. And I got a call from this was I guess around early July 2017. I got a call from a New York Times reporter who said, "Have you heard of a woman named Natalia Veselnitskaya?" And I said, yes, I have. In fact, Natalia Veselnitskaya was the Russian lawyer who was effectively working for the Kremlin, doing everything possible to discredit me in Washington so that the Magnitsky Act didn't get advanced. And I had been trying to get people interested in her for a long time, and nobody really was interested. And all of a sudden, the New York Times was calling up, and I said, and so I had a little presentation that I had prepared for journalists that had all not been interested in the previous year. And I took her, I was actually changing planes. I was flying from London to Aspen. I spend my summers in Aspen, and I was in Chicago, and I took her through the PowerPoint over the phone. I emailed her the PowerPoint, took her through it, and I said, well, you know, what has Natalia Veselnitskaya done? And she said, I can't tell you, but just watch the New York Times this afternoon, and I think you'll be interested to see. And so I kept on pressing refresh, and nothing was happening, and I get on the plane, and the Wi-Fi doesn't work. It's like, why is it always half the time it doesn't work when you most need it? And I get off the plane in Aspen, and I press refresh one more time, and all of a sudden the story comes up, and it said, Russian lawyer in Trump Tower meeting. Natalia Veselnitskaya, the lawyer for Putin, had gone to Trump Tower. This had happened a year before, but it only had come out in 2017. So it happened in 2016. She had gone to Trump Tower, and this was after Trump had been nominated, but before he was elected. And she met with Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, and Paul Manafort, so Trump's son-in-law, and campaign manager. And she said, if Trump is elected, will you invalidate or repeal the Magnitsky Act? And in return, I've got dirt on Hillary Clinton. And so, thankfully, and so it was a huge surprise to me that I was, and we eventually got a copy of Paul Manafort's notes. And Bill Browder was all over his notes, and it was just amazing to me that this was the big thing in 2016, 2017. There was a whole investigation about Russian interference in the U.S. political process, and not only were the Russians interfering, but they were interfering about me, and so that was pretty amazing and shocking. And for anyone who said that the Russians weren't interfering, I mean that's just direct proof that they were.
And then let's take it further, because Trump actually gets elected.
So he gets elected, and he wasn't able to repeal the Magnitsky Act because it wasn't an executive order. So if it had been an executive order, he could have just written another executive order saying now repealed. But it was an act of Congress, and because it was an act of Congress, in order to repeal it, he would have needed to get 51%, more than 51% of congressmen to vote against it, and that was never going to happen. And so it wasn't repealed, but Putin kept on being more and more mad at me. And so Trump gets elected president, and they have Putin and Trump have their first summit
in Helsinki.
In Helsinki. This is in July of 2018. So I'm again in Aspen as the summit is taking place, and I'm actually beginning to write my second book. It's called Freezing Order. I hadn't written it yet. I just had a blank computer screen in front of me. And there's nothing worse when you're writing a book than having a blank computer screen. It's the worst moment of writing a book. And it was the day of the summit. So I was sitting in my dining room. I told all of my children to stay away from the dining room for the next 4 hours until lunchtime. I'm going to be doing writing. I get my computer, I turn off the internet so there's no emails coming in and stuff like that. I put my phone on silent face down, and I try to start writing this book, and I write a few paragraphs, I erase them, and I'm sure all of you know what that feels like, and on, and an hour later I'm still staring out the window. Nothing has been written. I can no longer manage it anymore, so I turn over my phone to see what's been happening. And there's 176 new messages. The first message said, Bill, are you watching Helsinki? The second message said, if you need a place to hide out, you can use my cabin in the mountains. So the summit was taking place on the Monday. On the previous Friday, Robert Mueller, the special counsel investigating Russian interference in the U.S. political process, had indicted 12 Russian GRU officers, military intelligence officers, for hacking the US election. And so the obvious question was, what was Putin going to do about this, or what was Trump and what was Putin going to do about this when the whole subject came up at the summit? So these two presidents have a meeting, a secret meeting, I should point out. There was no staff, no Secretary of State, no National Security Advisor, just the President of the United States, President of Russia, and one of Putin's guys. So they go into the secret meeting. They sit there for 4.5 hours discussing things that we don't know to this day. They emerge from this meeting. They go to the press conference and they go up at their separate lecterns. Putin looks like he owns the place. Trump is sort of slouched over like he had a really bad 4.5 hours. And the questions begin. And the Reuters journalist raises his hand directed towards Putin and said, Mr. President, are you planning on handing over the 12 GRU officers? Putin smiles. He's been expecting this question, preparing for it all weekend. And he says, yes, it's entirely possible that we would. But if we did, we would expect some reciprocity from our good friends, the Americans. And specifically, we would expect them to hand over Bill Browder, me. Of like the 8 billion people on the planet, I'm the one brought up in the summit.
In exchange for 12.
In exchange for 12, and we're going to get to that in a second. So Putin wants me handed over, which was very unpleasant, obviously. But it wasn't a surprise. As I mentioned, he's hated me since the passage of the Magnitsky Act and done all this crazy stuff to try to get me. And normally he never mentions the name of any of his enemies. It's like a real mafia thing. You never mention the name of your enemies because they're not people. They're people. They're like objects to be killed. And so if you watch Putin, like the way I do, like he's never mentioned the name Alexei Navalny, ever, who's one of his big enemies. Nor many other people. He calls them that lawyer, that activist, that person, because they're not individual human beings. They're people to be killed. And he started mentioning my name in 2012, and which was really unusual. And what it meant was I really truly got under his skin with this whole Magnitsky thing, and not just mentioning my name, but the body language is just. Normally he has a poker face, but his forehead furls up, and he just gets so angry. You can just see his anger. And I wasn't surprised. But what did surprise me was what happened next. And the next question was to President Trump. Mr. President, what do you think of Putin's offer? And without skipping a beat, Trump says, I think it's an incredible offer.
I think I have a great picture for you. Yeah. This must be giving you chills. Yeah.
And so here I'm sitting in Aspen, Colorado, and the most powerful man in the free world has just offered to hand me over to a guy who wants to kill me. And I could just picture a bunch of SUVs approaching where I was staying, with putting a bag over my head and sticking me on a rendition flight back to Moscow, and it was terrifying. So the summit ends, and I was expecting as soon as it ended, the staff of Trump would have gathered the press corps and said on the Air Force One and said, we just want to clarify one thing. What he meant to say, it was incredibly bad offer or something like that, but total silence. So Trump gets back to Washington, Putin goes to Moscow, and overnight Putin, who prides himself on being the most vicious master negotiator, realized he had made a terrible mistake. The Americans had asked for 12, and he just asked for 1. What kind of schmuck was he for making such a stupid proposal? And so overnight he decided to add 11 other people to his list. The first person among those 11 was former US Ambassador and Stanford professor Mike McFaul, who's a good friend of mine, somebody I'm seeing after our session here. And they didn't like him because he was the behind-the-scenes guy who helped get the Magnitsky Act passed when he was the National Security Advisor. He asked for a guy named Kyle Parker, who was the chief of staff to the congressional committee that wrote the Magnitsky Act. He asked for 3 Department of Homeland Security agents who were investigating money laundering connected to the murder of Sergei Magnitsky. Everybody among these 11 that he asked for had helped in some way on the Magnitsky Justice Campaign and were either previously or currently employed by the US government. Now, it's one thing to ask for me, a private citizen, and a citizen of the UK, by the way, to be handed over. That's distasteful, but not shocking. But to ask for US government officials to be handed over for doing their work, their policy work, that was unbelievable. And who would ever go work in the US government again if you think that in some future government you could be handed over to hostile foreign power for just doing your job for the government? Of course, nobody would. And so the Trump people should have pushed back on that immediately and firmly. But they didn't. Total silence. Silence for 1 day, silence for 2 days, silence for 3 days. On the 4th day, I'm giving a media interview. And by the way, all of a sudden, everyone wanted to know, who is this guy, Bill Browder? Because no one had ever heard of me before. And all of a sudden, I'm being brought up as some kind of swapping currency with the Russians. And so I'm doing all these media interviews. I'm doing a media interview on the 4th day. And in the middle of the interview, they say, we need to stop the interview because there's a press conference going on at the White House. Just stay on the line. And so they go to this press conference in the White House. And in the White House, it's Sarah Huckabee Sanders. Remember her? And she's giving a press conference. And the New York Times correspondent, White House correspondent, Maggie Haberman, raises her hand and she says, are you planning on handing over Bill Browder, Ambassador McFaul, and the 10 other Americans? And this was the moment that she could have pushed back hard. But instead, she said, the president is considering the whole thing. He's consulting his advisors. We'll let you know. At this point, all hell breaks loose in Washington. And the Senate decides that they're going to have a vote on whether or not to hand us over. And the vote's going to take place at 4:30 the next day. And as the day progresses, senators, and this is not a partisan issue at all, this is like from the far left to the far right and everywhere in between, start issuing tweets and press releases saying this is outrageous, we're not going to do this, absolutely no way. And it looked like the tide was going to turn terribly for the White House. And so at 3:30, an hour before the vote, the White House issues a very meek statement saying, while we understand that Putin's request was sincere, we're going to be unable to honor it at this time. At this time. An hour later, the Senate votes 98-0 not to hand us over. So that's why I'm so happy to be here today.
Oh, we are too, for sure. And so from that point, let's now travel back to today and turn our attention to the ongoing war in Ukraine. You've been very vocal about supporting the Ukraine and sanctioning the Russians. But in the first place, did you expect this war? Knowing Putin, do you think this is something we could have forecasted?
Well, yes and no and yes. There's a lot of things that we did. So, first of all, if many people asked me in the month or so leading up to the war, as various announcements were made about the troop buildup on the border, would Putin do it? And I said, I can't imagine that he would, because the army, the military budget of Russia at the time was the same as the military budget of the UK, and about 80 to 90% of that was stolen. So it just seemed like the military was weak. The size of the Russian economy was the size of the economy of the state of New York. Russia is not a superpower. And I thought to myself, why would Putin do this? It would be insanity for him to do it. And so when people asked me, I thought this is just a great way to get the German chancellor and the French president and all these people shuttling through Moscow, kissing the ring and all this kind of stuff. And I thought there's just no way that he would do it. It would be too stupid for him to do. And he did it. But I've got a pretty clear idea why he did it, and this is really important, and it stems very much from my own story, the story of Magnitsky and the story of what we discovered. When we were, so Sergei Magnitsky was killed over the theft of $230 million of taxes that we paid to the Russian government that was stolen from the Russian government. Sergei Magnitsky was my tax attorney, and he was able to figure out that a bunch of corrupt officials had stolen $230 million from their own country. He exposed it, and for exposing it, he was then put in pretrial detention by the same people who he had exposed and was tortured for 358 days and killed on November 16, 2009. And for me, one of the most important parts of the justice campaign was to see who actually got the $230 million. And so we then started to work on that. And I applied all the same skills that I learned at the GSB towards money laundering analysis. And I had some really good people working for me. If you read my second book, there's a hero in the book named Vadim Kleiner, who is a Russian PhD who had been a securities analyst who became probably the world's foremost money laundering investigators over the last 13 years. And he started putting together all different information we were getting. We were getting data from whistleblowers, from data leaks, from criminal investigations that we had launched. And he put together this database and connected the dots and so on. And he had this incredible database. And in the process, we discovered two really important things which helps understand everything about Russia. The first thing we discovered, you remember the Panama Papers? There was a big data leak in 2017. A Panamanian law firm called Mossack Fonseca, all of their information leaked. Apparently, some secretary in the firm was having an affair with either Mr. Mossack or Mr. Fonseca. The affair went bad. She decided to copy the entire hard disk of the firm, handed it over to a journalist at Süddeutsche Zeitung. He looked at this and said, "This is incredible," and divided it up by country. And they had a correspondent in each country figure out who the hero or the anti-hero was of that country. And the Russian anti-hero was a man named Sergei Roldugin. Sergei Roldugin is a cellist from St. Petersburg. And from the Panama Papers, it was discovered that Mr. Roldugin was worth $2 billion. The next richest cellist in the world is Yo-Yo Ma. He's worth 25 million. And here's this unknown Russian cellist who's worth 2 billion. And underneath, if you look at the granular detail,
Russians love culture.
well, this is what Putin said. He must have bought and sold all the Stradivariuses or whatever. But underneath, you had all this information. And for example, there's a transaction in which a Russian oligarch pays the cellist $56 million as an investment advisory fee. I mean, how does a cellist, oligarchs will kill you for $5,000, but they'll pay a cellist $56 million for investment advisory fee?
They call it pivot at the GSB.
And on and on and on. Other oligarchs, state banks were giving this guy all this money. So why would this cellist get all this money when people are ready to kill you for $5,000? And the answer is because this is no ordinary cellist. This is Putin's best friend from childhood. He's the godfather of Putin's daughter. He's the person who introduced Putin to his wife. And most importantly, this is the guy who stands as a nominee trustee for Vladimir Putin. Big discovery. Particularly big discovery for us. Because Vadim Kleiner, my former securities analyst, now money laundering investigator, has this big database. And so he types in Sergei Roldugin into our database, and he gets a hit. Vladimir Putin was one of the beneficiaries of the $230 million crime that Sergei Magnitsky discovered and was killed over, which explains why he's been chasing me around the world, why his forehead furls up when he's discussing my name, because he was a beneficiary of the crime that I've now put out there with all bells and whistles. So that was the first most interesting discovery. The second, even more interesting discovery was as Vadim was doing this analysis, he discovered that there was one bank in which 200 of the $230 million that we discovered that was stolen was laundered through. It was called Danske Bank, the largest bank in Denmark, and it was their Estonian branch. And so we took this information, we filed criminal complaints in Denmark, in Estonia. We then gave it to all journalists around the world, lots of fanfare about this Danske Bank being involved in the Magnitsky case, 200 million. And one day, a few weeks later, we got a call from an investigative journalist team at the largest newspaper in Copenhagen. And they said, we've just been given a huge data leak. We call it the Russian laundromat. It has a lot of information about transactions at Danske Bank. We're having trouble making sense of all this raw data. If you can give us your analysis, perhaps we can look at the names of the companies, the names of the accounts, and that will help us understand what other money has been stolen from Russia and laundered through Danske Bank. So we gladly hand it over. A lot of the work that we do is with investigative journalists. They help us a lot. They took the information, compared it to their information, and came back to us and said the number wasn't actually just 200 million that had been stolen from Russia and laundered through Danske Bank. It was 8.3 billion. They wrote it up in their newspaper. It was the most well-read story in the history of their newspaper. And Denmark is considered to be the second most honest country in the world by Transparency International. And you can't be the CEO of this bank, the biggest bank in their country, and just kind of shrug it off. And so the CEO of Danske Bank then hired an outside law firm, an outside accounting firm, and an outside data analysis firm, lifted the hood on the bank, allowed them to look at everything to determine what really happened. And they came back a few months later, and they said it wasn't just 8.3 billion, it was $232 billion was stolen from Russia and laundered through their bank. This is just one bank in Scandinavia. If we had the same opportunity to lift the hood on Raiffeisen Bank in Vienna, on UBS, Credit Suisse in Zurich, on Deutsche Bank in Frankfurt, and a few other banks, I think the amount of money that we would discover had been stolen out of Russia and laundered through the Western banking system would be $1 trillion. This would have been $1 trillion that Putin and about 1,000 other people around him have stolen from the Russian state over a 22-year period. And that is just an enormous amount of money, and it's money that should have been spent on hospitals and schools and roads and public services. Instead was spent on private jets and yachts, Swiss bank accounts, villas, etc. You can do that for a year, maybe 5 years, maybe even a decade. Maybe you could steal 10 or 20 or $30 billion and get away with it. But doing it over 22 years and stealing $1 trillion, it's creating the most flammable situation you can imagine. And the real problem for Putin is that there is no retirement for this man. There's no Putin presidential library that he can go to and paint or whatever you do as an ex-president, enjoy all the money he's stolen. Putin is living in a world where if he's not in power, he loses all the money he stole, he goes to jail, and he dies. And so for Putin, the idea that this tinderbox is going to light up is a mortal risk. And it's not a low probability risk. In Kazakhstan, the dictator of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev, lost his position in exactly the same circumstances. Lukashenko almost did, only in Belarus, and he was only saved by Putin sending his own guys in. And of course, we've seen what happened to Yanukovych in Ukraine and various other people. Putin understood that his days were numbered, and he needed to do something radical in order to deflect the brewing anger from the Russian people. And so what do you do if you're a dictator, you're afraid of your own people rising up, and you want to make sure that they don't? You find somebody else for them to be angry with. And that's what this war in Ukraine is all about. This war in Ukraine is not about NATO enlargement. It's not about some grand vision of a Russian empire. He uses those arguments because those arguments sound good. But this is just a little man who's afraid of dying, who's stolen too much money, and he needs a foreign enemy. This is a war of distraction. And the reason why this insight is so important is that if you believe my interpretation, which is not the conventional wisdom, the conventional wisdom is that it's something to do with NATO and being snubbed by the West and so on and so forth. But if you believe my version, then it means that there's nothing we can do to negotiate. It's not like if we were to say, okay, Ukraine will be non-aligned and not a member of NATO, and that doesn't solve the problem for Putin. Because Putin needs to be at war. And the most horrifying part of this story is that if Putin were to succeed in Ukraine, he'd still need to be at war. And who does he then go to war with? Estonia or Lithuania or Poland. And then we've got a much bigger problem, because then either we have to engage with Putin militarily because those countries are members of NATO and we've signed a treaty with them to say that all for one and one for all, which means, and going to war with Russia is catastrophic, or potentially equally catastrophic, is to ignore our NATO commitments and let Putin take these countries. And so the situation we have in Ukraine is really, we have to do everything possible, and I mean everything possible, to allow the Ukrainians, to help the Ukrainians to win this war, because the alternative is catastrophic, and there is no middle ground, there's no settlement, there's no compromise.
But then in this picture of the world, do sanctions even help, or should it be just all about supplying weapons to Ukraine?
Well, there's two things going on. One is you need to help the Ukrainians fight back, and fight back hard, and you need to starve Putin of the financial resources to fund his war. And I would say the sanctions have worked a lot better than Putin says they've worked. Putin wants to have us all believe that sanctions aren't working. If he can create that narrative, which he does all the time, and I've read it in various places and people ask me often, the next logical step, well, if they're not working, maybe we shouldn't use them anymore. Well, that we don't want to do at all. What we want to do is make sure that the sanctions are so overwhelming and so suffocating that Putin doesn't have any money. And we've done a pretty good job so far, but not a complete job. So we've frozen $350 billion of the $650 billion war chest that Putin, he had a literal war chest, a chest for war. And he thought he had $650 billion. And all of a sudden, at the very beginning of the war, a week into it, the Western allies get together and freeze $350 billion. So that's money he can't draw on. Good. The other money he can draw on is oligarch money. We've sanctioned about 40 of the top 118 oligarchs. Good as well. It used to be that Russia is not a particularly indebted country because they defaulted on their debt a while ago. And so in theory, they could get as much money as they wanted from the capital markets, and so we've cut them off from the capital markets. That helps as well. A lot of Western companies have pulled out of Russia. That's good. We've stopped allowing them to import things like aircraft parts and ball bearings. Again, good. But the main thing that carries on is that they can still sell their oil and gas. They've stopped selling their gas to Europe, which is good, but they still sell oil all over the world. They sell it to the Indians and the Chinese and various other people like that. And we've got to do something to figure out how to stop that money from going to Russia. Because as long as they get that money, he can afford to buy weapons and fund the war. And as long as he can fund the war, he can carry on. And what I'll tell you is that he can endure, Russia can endure much more pain than we can in the West, because Russia is a dictatorship. There's no public discussion. And so what he's hoping for is that if he can convince us that sanctions don't work, maybe we won't add more sanctions on. And in the meantime, we're starting to get financially exhausted from this war. There's already people talking about it on the far right and the far left. There are people in the US Congress saying no more money for Ukraine. And he's hoping for the return of Donald Trump. Donald Trump has said publicly, as much as he's not going to, he says, we're going to end this war in one day. What does that mean? That he'll cut off funding for Ukraine. And so he's hoping that Donald Trump gets the Republican nomination, he becomes the next president, and so he's, now I should say that Putin has made a lot of bets that haven't worked out for him, but that's the bet he's making right now.
All right, thank you so much, Bill. I think we're roughly 40 minutes in. Why don't we take a few questions from the audience? If you want to ask a question, raise your hand, then stand up, and just to let you know, we are recording, so just make sure to introduce yourself.
Thank you.
All right. Yes, yes. And Ipshita, then you next. Yes, no, just okay. I'll repeat the question in the microphone.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. And my name is Yakov Barinsky. I was born in Russia, just like Olga. Currently, I live in the UK. And one of my questions is, I'm very much kind of a supporter of the theory that a lot of that money, 232 billion or probably much, much more, over $1 trillion, that have been laundered, have been taken out of the country throughout the Putin's reign, have been used to bribe politicians in Europe. Actually, I think this has been the #1 item on the list. And we can see that in places like Hungary today, Czech Republic, Austria, a few others, Germany for sure. My question is about the UK, because the UK, once again, my opinion, has been doing something very different from the other countries in Europe, being super open to Russian money in the beginning of 2000s, and a lot of shady capital has flown there throughout the beginning of the century, and then they became very, very strict in like one day, canceling the investor visa and other things. And my question is, how big is Putin's agent network in the UK still, and aren't you personally afraid to go to London?
I'll repeat for the mic the shortest version.
Well, why don't we? Did people hear it in the audience?
All right, then we
just so we don't. I mean, I don't know how it works with the video. Maybe the video heard it as well.
Should we repeat the question? The short version, obviously. Yes or no? Not okay. The question was, how big is the agent network of Putin still abroad today?
Big. It's very big. So London is the Russian money laundering capital of the world, and shocking. It's a shocking situation. I also live in London, and as I was talking about our tracing of the money, the largest amount of the money from the Magnitsky case came to London. And it also went to 26 other countries, but the largest amount went to London. And we applied to the law enforcement agencies of 26 countries to open criminal investigations and to freeze and seize the money. 16 countries opened criminal investigations and are in some process of freezing or seizing. One of the countries that didn't was the United Kingdom, where I live. And I've been to, I mean, it's harder to get a criminal money laundering investigation open in London than to get into Stanford Business School. I've been to 7 different law enforcement agencies, and I get rejections from every single one of them. And I mean, it's just shocking. And why is that the case? Because London was totally open, and in their openness, and Britain is, the British aristocracy is no longer wealthy, and so they're sort of like concierges for wealthy people from other countries, including Russians. And so a lot of very important people received money from Russians and made sure that the country remained a good place to do business. And it's very schizophrenic now, because on one hand, the British government is leading on the provision of weapons for Ukraine. But on the other hand, the British government has done very, very little in terms of, I mean, in the 22 years since Putin was in power, before the war started, there hadn't been a single investigation into Russian money laundering. And it's not clear that there's going to be any more investigations. And so I think that London is a viper's nest and will continue to be in there. And the end of your question is, am I not afraid to be in London? it's dangerous wherever I am. I mean, these people have a long arm and they do nasty stuff wherever, and so it's not. I don't think that London is a particularly more dangerous. My friend Dan Rappaport, who is a Russian, who was doing a lot of anti-Putin stuff, fell out of a eighth-story apartment building in Washington, D.C. Bad stuff happens everywhere when the Russians are after you, and so that's no reason for me to be one place or another.
So the question is how Russians abroad can affect change if they can't really return, and if they return, they'll face repercussions.
It's an impossible situation now. There's no longer any oxygen for any dissent whatsoever. You cannot say anything. You can't even hold up a sign, an empty piece of paper on a street corner. You'll be arrested and probably prosecuted and sent to jail for a very long time. However, the Russians who are abroad, I think, have a responsibility to call out Putin's criminal behavior. And coming back to the London question, there's a lot of Russians I know in London that are just like not saying anything, and I find that I think everybody has a responsibility, and I know the Russians who work for me are like so ashamed of what their country is doing that they're doing everything possible. They're bringing in Ukrainians to their house to stay, and whatever can be done. And I think it's Russia is an occupied country right now. It's occupied by a criminal regime, and I think that every Russian has a duty to do whatever they can to try to rid the country of that criminal regime. And I understand you don't have to be a hero, and being a hero in Russia, being a normal person. Just to be a normal person, you have to be a hero. You have to be ready to risk your life. But I don't think that that's true for Russians abroad, and I think everybody has to do something and say something. So I mean, the question is, what's going to happen next in Russia, post-Putin? So first of all, let me just say, the most likely scenario is that we're 5 years from now, and there's no post-Putin. The North Korea, has lasted through multiple versions of the Kim Jong-un family. Mugabe lasted for 35 years in Zimbabwe. I mean, these bad dictators running repressive totalitarian regimes, they've got all the tools at their disposal. And I think Putin has weakened himself profoundly, and to the extent that the probability has risen that it will be that there will be a post-Putin. But I think the most, much greater than 50% chance we're still here 5 years from now talking about Putin. If it was post-Putin, what could it be? Well, I think the most optimistic scenario, which I put at a very low probability, like 10%, is that there's a clean win, that Ukraine has a clean win. And what I mean by clean win, I mean there's no such thing as a clean win. Many people will die in this win. But what I mean by clean win is that they push Russian troops entirely out of their territory. And what that means is not just the Donbass but also Crimea. If Russia is expelled from Ukraine, I can't imagine a scenario where Putin can stay in power. I think the Russian people will say, why have we lost so much life? Why so many people have died? Why have we taken such an economic hit for a loser who put us in this position? That's the optimistic scenario. And if that were to happen, there's a real probability that people, that all the guys underneath Putin, people get angry at everybody, not just Putin, but his whole regime, and they're jumping on their airplanes and fleeing the country and getting arrested and so on and so forth. And if that were to happen, there is some scenario where the Vladimir Kara-Murzas of the world become the next leaders of Russia. It's a low probability scenario. I'd like to say it's higher probability. I'd like to encourage Vladimir that is the scenario. And that would be the best scenario for us, because there are a group of people who are sitting in jail, like Nelson Mandela sat in jail, who could be running the country. The higher probability scenario, and the really ugly scenario, is one where Putin gets deposed, and then who comes and fills the gap? Warlords in different places. The Kadyrov, the Chechen warlord, Prigozhin, Gazprom has got its own private military company, and there's like 30 or 40 of these other military companies that emerge, And it becomes like Somalia, where there's some very, very weak central government and a bunch of other people fighting over the assets. And the country goes from a FSB, secret police oligarchy, to a warlord oligarchy. And that's a very unstable situation as well. And you know, some people would say, in power would say, well, God, we don't want that. It'd be better to have Putin. I would say that it's not really our place to decide how they end up. It's our place to contain Russia after it, you know, it's to contain them now and to contain them in the future. And if a good government emerges from these good guys in jail, all the better. But if it doesn't, you know, we can't dictate how that process is going to emerge, but all we can do is just make sure that they can't export all their violence and criminality to the West.
We'll take 2 more questions. I think there was a question in the back.
So the question is, sanctions are not being done by everybody. There's a lot of people who are helping the Russians evade sanctions. What do we do about that? And that's really an important issue, which is Dubai, Turkey, India, China, all these countries are helping the Russians evade sanctions. At the end of the day, it doesn't particularly help a Russian oligarch who has a house in Gstaad and one in Saint-Tropez and one in New York City to have to go to Turkey or Dubai. That's not like a great outcome for them. But it's not, of course, a disastrous outcome either. But the most important thing with these sanctions is that it's really impossible to do any international business if you're on a sanctions list. If you're on the sanctions list, sure, you can evade sanctions, you can have people help you do that, but it doesn't help you reconstitute your empire and carry on doing your business. And I'll tell you a couple of good examples. If China were supplying weapons to Russia, the war would be disastrous for Ukraine. We'd be in a much worse position. But China, they're ready to do some business with Russia, but they're not ready to be under sanctions themselves. And they would be under sanctions themselves if all of a sudden we saw unexploded Chinese rockets in buildings where children have died. We would stop doing business to some extent, stop doing business with China. And China's a business country, and they might like to watch us getting a black eye from what Russia is doing, but they certainly don't want to pay a price for that business-wise. And another example is India. India is buying a lot of oil and weapons from Russia. And the Indians are only willing to pay the Russians in rupees, in Indian rupees, because they don't want to be subject to US sanctions. And so the Russians have a terrible problem, because what do they do with these rupees now? And they've actually stopped supplying weapons because they want to be paid in something other than rupees. And so it's not very clean, it's not very helpful. I meet with a lot of governments around the world to talk to them about sanctions, and this is the year of sanctions evasion, or I should say punishing sanctions evasion. And so I think you're going to see a lot more things happening. Will it completely dry up these opportunities? No. Will it make life more difficult for Russians, oligarchs and Russian government? Absolutely yes.
I'll reserve the right for the last very short question. Many of us are about to graduate. Do you have any piece of wisdom to share with us?
Well, for all you Russians, don't go back to Russia. But
I'll tell the U.S. consul.
But I think that's probably pretty obvious. You know, I think that the world is a very interesting place, and even with all this terrible stuff going on, you know, there's a lot of great business opportunities, and there's a lot of good opportunities to make a difference. I spent half my career making money, and I'm spending the second half making a difference, and you should strive to do both in your life.
Will do. Thank you so much.